My name is Linda Polman. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. But I travel abroad a lot because my subject is abroad. Since the beginning of the 1990s, I've been following international military and humanitarian interventions. For several years in the 90s, I've been traveling after blue-helmeted soldiers from the United Nations, which I stumbled upon in Somalia. I happened to be in Somalia as a journalist, and there I discovered the wondrous world of UN peacekeeping missions. So the things that I found out about peacekeeping missions, I wanted to test in other countries if the procedures, the failures, the possibilities and the impossibilities of UN peacekeeping missions was the same in Somalia as in other countries. So after Somalia, I went to Rwanda to see what Blue Helmets were doing there, and I went to Haiti to see what they were doing there. And then I ended the UN soldier story in Sierra Leone, where I slowly shifted my focus to what was happening around UN soldiers, which was international humanitarian interventionists, the international aid organizations. So this is what I've been doing in the past 2 decades already. See how we in the West intervene in somebody else's war, either military or humanitarian.
About the military interventions and about UN peace operations, what are the main failures or challenges that you've seen in Somalia and then in Rwanda, in Congo, in Sierra Leone?
Well, what I found, for me, that was a great discovery at the time. What I found was that the UN is actually a powerless organization. It has no money of itself. It has no power of itself. It cannot decide anything. If you see blue helmet soldiers somewhere, then it is because the UN was told to send them. It is not because the UN found it necessary. It was because the UN member states and the most powerful member states decided that for their own reasons, for their own agendas, it was important to send those blue helmet soldiers there. And the UN, the only thing that the UN can do is say, yes, sir, we will find those soldiers. So the powerlessness of the United Nations and the power of the UN member states, the states especially that man the UN Security Council, that powerlessness totally surprised me. And what surprised me next is that the UN still gets blamed for all the UN failures, even if it was not the UN to have decided where to send those soldiers, with what mandate, with what budget, and with which soldiers. Even if it was not the UN who decided that, the UN would still be blamed for the failures. The operation in Somalia in the 90s went down into the history books as one of the UN's biggest failures, where in fact it was not the UN at all who was failing, it was the UN member states who left the UN there without any backbone, military backbone, without any budget, without any power against the Somali warlords. And still we all believed that it was the UN's failure. So and in the end, you know, it all ends with being cynical about the UN, because we read in the newspapers all the time that the UN has failed. The UN is this big money-consuming bureaucracy. There's no point in having the UN. It only costs money, you know. This whole skepticism about the UN, this whole cynicism about the UN, will in the end destroy the UN in its entirety. And I think that we should prevent, because the UN is all we have in the end. So this is what I looked into in how the power mechanism worked. I went for the book that I wrote about UN peacekeeping. I spent several weeks inside the UN building in New York to see how Security Council resolutions about sending UN soldiers to a place, how those resolutions were made, why were they made, by whom were they made, what was the negotiations that went before the resolutions, and then travel to those places and see how the UN soldiers were managing that.
And so how were those resolutions made?
One American diplomat inside New York, inside the building, told me that I didn't want to know how those resolutions were made, because UN resolutions are like sausages. If you know what's inside them, you never want to eat them again. But if you actually study how the resolutions are made, then you see it's politics. It has very little to do with the UN mandate of protecting the people of the world, of balancing peace and war. It's a bunch of powerful UN member states that actually dictate the UN where to go. And if America found it necessary to send a UN peacekeeping mission to Haiti, then Russia would say, we will only agree if you give us a peacekeeping mission in Georgia, for example. So it's bargaining. It is negotiating about amongst powerful states who would use the UN as their foreign policy instrument.
And can you give an example of how this bargaining among UN member states works out in the locality of a peace mission?
Well, that means that for their agendas and for their purposes, UN member states decide that Rwanda should have a UN mission, and then you send UN soldiers into a situation that they can do nothing about. It was really dangerous. UN soldiers are often sent into places that are really dangerous and very confusing and big chaos, and then you send those soldiers there so as international community you can actually present yourself and say, look, we did something about it, we sent a peacekeeping mission, so you cannot blame us for just standing by and doing nothing. We are acting here, we sent blue helmet soldiers. But in fact, you are sending traffic cops into a war zone. You are sending men without proper training, without proper equipment, with a mandate that limits them to very, very small possibilities to actually do something. So you send them as a powerless force into very, very dangerous and complicated situations. And then in the end, when those blue helmet soldiers fail, you can all say, see, the UN is failing again. So it is a totally unfair situation in which the UN is not given the chance to actually win the battle there, because they don't have the mandate and they don't have the money.
But isn't it possible that a UN peace mission would sort of by accident do a lot of good, even though it's come about in a very problematic way?
Yes. I became a great admirer of many UN battalions, because they were doing wonderful humanitarian work, for example. They would go, for example, I saw them in action in a place like Sierra Leone in West Africa, places where that had been ruled by rebels. And I saw UN forces move into Sierra Leone and slowly massage the rebels out of Sierra Leone. Slowly and very cleverly, they pushed the rebels back, into the bush. And the UN would move in and start governing there, and people would feel safe and people would feel secure. They would act like police, people would come to them and say, oh, my neighbor stole my cow, and the UN would actually do something about it. So they gave people a sort of protection, and they gave people the sense of security. Would it have gone wrong in Sierra Leone? Would the rebels actually have come out of the bush again and attacked the UN soldiers? They would not have had the mandate to do anything about it. So under certain circumstances, the UN can actually do a lot of good. But as soon as they have to start fighting, then things go wrong.
So would you say that the UN works well when there is no violence?
Yes, where in situations where you need traffic cops. Yes.